Welcome back to the Haunted Beard, everybody. My name is Jake. Thank you for joining me. Today, I want to give you my thoughts and review for Smile 2. And this is, of course, the sequel to the original film that came out just a couple years ago. Overall, I enjoyed the first film. It didn't do anything mind-blowing, but I thought it was, fairly effective, had some, pretty good sequences, but was by no means a classic. So I was curious, though, to see what they were going to do here with the follow-up. So Smile 2 introduces us to global pop sensation Sky Riley, who begins experiencing increasingly terrifying and inexplicable events. Overwhelmed by the escalating horrors and the pressure of fame, Sky is forced to face her past. And having now seen both of these, and both of these being directed by Parker Finn, I feel pretty safe in saying this guy is a talented director. And there are a handful of sequences in Smile 2, much like the original film, that I think are quite effective and just very well directed. Case in point, the opening 8 minutes of this film, I think, are quite good. As we pick up with Kyle Gallner's character from the first film as he goes into this house to try to transfer the Smile entity to these drug dealers, only, all hell breaks loose and it goes very, very bad. But just a really good way to open the film. I like how it's all one shot, just kind of really pulls you in, makes it a very kind of immersive experience. Some really nice camera work here as well. And it's just a very intense, crazy scene that ends with a pretty shocking moment. And so kind of right from the get-go, it does a good job really grabbing you and pulling you right into this story. We're then introduced to our main character, Sky Riley, played by Naomi Scott, and I think she is probably the highlight of the film for me. I thought her performance in this was pretty fantastic, and honestly, one of the better performances I have seen so far this year. And I was just really impressed with her overall. This is such an intensely emotional experience. I mean, she's in pretty much every scene in this movie, and every scene in this movie has some very intense emotional aspect to it, and she really sells it. This is a character who is very much on edge, anxious, stressed out, overwhelmed, just she's on the brink of losing her mind in virtually every scene, and she really sells just the emotional, fragile state very, very well. I was really impressed with her performance. I think she elevates this film to the next level and does a fantastic job. And here's the thing about Smile 2. This film, for me, it left something to be desired from a narrative standpoint and from a story standpoint. However, what we get is such an intense kind of roller coaster thrill ride that it's still a pretty worthwhile and enjoyable experience. And part of what makes it a good experience comes back to the directing by Parker Finn, as he is really able to get quite a bit out of this concept. And I mean, to be honest, this is a pretty silly concept of a movie. I mean, this entity that kind of causes people to smile in this very sort of sinister kind of way. It's just kind of a silly concept. This almost feels like, this film feels like what should be kind of a very cheap sort of PG-13 entry-level horror film, only they elevate that to an R rating and add in some blood and gore and stuff like that. And they put in the hands of who has turned out to be quite a competent and very talented director. And so he really does kind of direct the heck out of this thing. I feel like this is a concept that it shouldn't be kind of as intense and sort of thrilling as it is. But again, I think that just comes back to how the film is directed. And what makes this movie overall a pretty enjoyable ride has to do with the fact that Finn is able to kind of prolong tension throughout, like, almost the entire movie. There's something intensely dramatic or intensely freaky or scary happening in almost every scene. And so even if you're not at a scene that's, quote unquote scary, there's still something dramatic and emotional going on with our main character. And so it really has just kind of this almost emotional roller coaster ride type feel to it. As really, you know, the smile is kind of I guess, a symbolic or metaphorical, right, for kind of mental health. And, you know, this entity feeds on people who have trauma and, you know, anxiety and all sorts of stuff like that. And so it really kind of plays into that whole psychological, emotional aspect. And so you really just have a lot of thrills and a lot of tension. And again, it's all directed quite well. There's a handful of scenes that I think, in addition to that opening 8 minutes, that stand out pretty well. A couple other scenes in the film that stood out for me. There's a scene later on where there's a bunch of people in Sky's apartment, and they're all, you know, giving her the smile look, and they start chasing after her and everything. And they grab her, and they're kind of like, you know, flipping her around and turning her over, and it almost becomes this sort of like dance choreography type thing that's kind of reminiscent of some of the performances that she does on stage. But I kind of like just the whole kind of choreographed type feel to it was kind of cool. There's another scene later on that takes place at a wellness center hospital that has some, you know, kind of pretty intense moments to it and pretty shocking moments and stuff like that. And the movie, too, has some nice kind of visual flares to it. There's some interesting camera angles and interesting kind of editing choices and in transitions and things like that. And so, again, Finn just kind of has a way to kind of keep things visually interesting to help keep you engaged. And as I said a minute ago, this is a film that did leave something to be desired from a story narrative perspective, as there's definitely times throughout the film that things felt familiar and things feel a bit repetitive. As the setup here is pretty similar. I mean, it's nearly the same exact thing as the first film. Only here it's just a little bit bigger, right? You can tell that they had more money here. It's a bigger budget. There's bigger set pieces and things like that. But they kind of retread quite a bit of the same territory. And so not only does the film feel repetitive because it's very similar to the original film, it also is kind of repetitive within itself, as the film goes back to the same well a handful of times. This whole sort of what's real and what's just a vision sort of thing, like what's actual reality and what's just, you know, what is our main character seeing just because she's being influenced by the smile entity, so to speak. And so that gets a little repetitive too. And so this is a film that I feel like probably doesn't have as much of a rewatchability factor to it. It probably won't be as much fun on a rewatch. And I'm curious though, because based on how the film ends, and with movies like this, it'd be very easy for them to set up a part 3 and do a trilogy. And the thing is like, I would be curious, but I'm really going to need to see something more from a story standpoint. When you give me two films that are very similar, you know, you start things off and see how people like the idea. Part 2, you maybe kind of, you know, blow it up, expand it, make things a little bit bigger and kind of more intense. But if you start kind of entering into, you know, franchise territory and you start getting into part 3 and part 4, you're going to need to do something from a story perspective for those to kind of justify their existence. And so part 2 doesn't really expand on anything. It doesn't really give us any information into this entity that we didn't know beforehand. And so if they're going to continue with this franchise, I'm going to need to see something more from a story perspective in order to kind of really buy into it. But as this film sits, like I said, I enjoyed my time for the most part while acknowledging some of the film's issues and flaws. And so overall, I'm kind of close to a 7 just because I did have a fun time with it, but I'm probably going to go like 6.5 out of 10 for Smile 2. So those are my thoughts on this one. Hit me up down below. Would be very curious in hearing your guys' thoughts on this one. Did you like this one more or less than the first film? Would you be interested in seeing a trilogy in this one as well? Would love to hear from you. Once again, thank you so much for watching. If you got anything out of this video, go ahead and do me a favor and do not click that subscribe button unless you want to be haunted by the beard.